The battlefield had fallen silent. Only a few hours earlier, the earth had trembled beneath the feet of thousands of soldiers. War elephants had charged through clouds of dust. Archers had darkened the sky with endless waves of arrows. The clash of steel, the cries of warriors, and the thunder of drums had echoed across the plains of Kalinga. Victory belonged to one man. His armies had crushed a kingdom that had refused to surrender. Now there was only silence. A thin layer of smoke drifted across the broken landscape as the first light of dawn reached the horizon. Burned chariots lay scattered across the field. Broken shields rested beside abandoned spears. The banners that had once flown proudly above marching armies now hung torn and motionless in the cool morning breeze. Thousands of lives had ended here. The battlefield stretched farther than the eye could see. Among the fallen were soldiers who had sworn loyalty to their king, farmers who had taken up weapons to defend their homes, craftsmen who had never imagined they would die in battle, and children caught in the chaos of a war they could neither understand nor escape. The cost of victory could no longer be measured in conquered land. It was measured in human lives. Across this sea of devastation walked the most powerful ruler in Asia. His name was Ashoka. His armor still carried the dust of battle. His sword remained at his side, but for the first time in many years it felt unbearably heavy. Every step carried him past another reminder of the price of conquest. The cheers of his soldiers had faded into the distance. Even the victorious army seemed strangely quiet, as though the battlefield itself demanded silence. Ancient inscriptions tell us that the conquest of Kalinga claimed more than 100,000 lives and displaced many more. Historians continue to debate the exact numbers, but they agree on something far more important. The battle marked a profound turning point in Ashoka's reign. Whether the change came in a single moment or unfolded over months, the emperor who emerged afterward would rule very differently from the conqueror who had entered the campaign. Standing in the middle of the battlefield, Ashoka looked across the destruction his empire had created. For years he had believed strength was measured by the kingdoms a ruler could conquer. He had spent his life proving himself worthy of the Mauryan throne. Every campaign had expanded his borders. Every victory had increased his reputation. Every defeated enemy had strengthened his empire. By every measure known to the ancient world, he had achieved greatness. Yet as the morning light revealed the true cost of that greatness, another question began to take shape. What if the greatest victory a ruler could ever achieve was not over another kingdom, but over himself? History remembers many conquerors. It remembers Alexander. It remembers Julius Caesar. It remembers Genghis Khan. But among them stands one emperor whose greatest achievement was not the empire he built through war. It was the peace he chose after witnessing the consequences of it. To understand how one of history's most feared rulers became one of its most remarkable leaders, we must travel back to an India unlike the one we know today. An India divided into competing kingdoms, powerful dynasties, and ambitious rulers, where the future of an entire civilization hung in the balance. This is the story of Ashoka, the emperor who conquered nearly an entire subcontinent, only to discover that the hardest battle he would ever fight was against the man staring back at him. If this story awakens your curiosity about the civilizations that shaped our world, the leaders who changed the course of history, and the timeless lessons hidden within the past, consider subscribing. It's a small gesture, but it helps us bring more carefully researched cinematic documentaries to people who share the same passion for history. And with every episode, you'll join us on a journey to uncover the stories, empires, and forgotten moments that continue to shape the world we live in today. Chapter 1: A World Before Ashoka. More than 2,000 years ago, long before the borders of modern nations were drawn, the Indian subcontinent was a land of remarkable diversity and constant change. Powerful kingdoms competed for wealth, influence, and survival across vast landscapes that stretched from the snow-covered peaks of the Himalayas to the tropical shores of the Indian Ocean. Bustling cities thrived along great rivers, merchants carried precious goods across dangerous trade routes, and scholars gathered in centers of learning to debate philosophy, politics, and the meaning of life. It was a world rich in culture and opportunity, but also one shaped by rivalry, ambition, and war. Every ruler dreamed of expanding their kingdom, yet few possessed the vision, resources, or determination to unite such an enormous and diverse land under a single empire. Only a few generations earlier, the balance of power had been dramatically shaken by the arrival of Alexander the Great. In 326 BCE, the Macedonian king crossed the Indus River and marched into northwestern India after conquering the mighty Persian Empire. Although Alexander never advanced deep into the Indian subcontinent, his campaign changed the political landscape forever. Local kingdoms were weakened, alliances shifted, and new opportunities emerged for ambitious leaders willing to seize them. After Alexander's death, his empire quickly fractured, leaving behind uncertainty throughout much of Asia. In northern India, that uncertainty created the perfect conditions for the rise of a new power. That opportunity was recognized by a remarkable young leader named Chandragupta Maurya. Guided by his brilliant advisor Chanakya, also known as Kautilya, Chandragupta began uniting scattered kingdoms through military skill, political strategy, and careful administration. Together, they laid the foundations of what would become the Mauryan Empire, the first empire to unite much of the Indian subcontinent under a single government. Their capital, Pataliputra, grew into one of the largest and most sophisticated cities of the ancient world. Protected by massive wooden walls and surrounded by rivers, it became the political, economic, and cultural heart of the empire. Roads connected distant provinces, trade flourished across Asia, and an efficient system of governance allowed the empire to manage millions of people across thousands of miles. Following Chandragupta's reign, the throne passed to his son, Emperor Bindusara, who continued expanding and strengthening the empire. Under his leadership, Mauryan influence spread farther south, while peace and prosperity allowed agriculture, commerce, and learning to flourish. By the time Bindusara ruled, the Mauryan Empire was already one of the greatest political powers in the world. Yet maintaining such a vast empire was no simple task. Every province required loyal governors, every border demanded protection, and every decision made in the royal court could affect countless lives. The future of the empire depended not only on strong institutions, but also on the character of the ruler who would one day inherit the throne. Within the magnificent palace at Pataliputra, surrounded by luxury, politics, and constant competition, a prince was growing up who would eventually change the course of history. His name was Ashoka. At the time, however, there was little to suggest that he would become one of history's most influential emperors. Like many royal families, the Mauryan dynasty contained numerous princes, each supported by different factions within the court. Questions of succession often created rivalry among brothers, as ministers, generals, and nobles quietly positioned themselves behind the candidates they believed would one day wear the imperial crown. In such an environment, birth alone did not guarantee power. Every prince had to prove his worth through intelligence, courage, leadership, and the ability to command respect. Historical records describing Ashoka's childhood are limited, and much of what survives comes from Buddhist texts written centuries after his death. These accounts sometimes blend historical events with legend, making it difficult to separate fact from tradition. Even so, historians generally agree that Ashoka received the education expected of a future ruler. He was trained in military tactics, statecraft, diplomacy, law, and administration. He learned how to command armies, govern provinces, negotiate with rival kingdoms, and make decisions that could determine the fate of an empire. From an early age, he was exposed to the realities of leadership in a world where strength often determined survival. As Ashoka grew older, he gained valuable experience serving as a provincial governor, where he demonstrated intelligence, determination, and an ability to restore order during times of unrest. These early responsibilities earned him the respect of many military commanders and administrators, but they also attracted rivals who viewed his growing influence with suspicion. Inside the royal court, political alliances shifted constantly, and the struggle for succession quietly intensified. Few could have predicted exactly how those rivalries would unfold, but one thing was becoming increasingly clear. The future of the Mauryan Empire would soon depend on a prince whose greatest battles had not yet begun. Before he could become the emperor remembered throughout history, Ashoka would first have to fight for the throne itself. Chapter 2: The Prince Nobody Expected. Long before Ashoka became one of history's most admired rulers, he was simply a young prince growing up within the vast and powerful Mauryan Empire. He was born into a royal family whose influence stretched across much of the Indian subcontinent, where expectations were immense and competition for power began long before a prince was old enough to wear a crown. Every child born into the Mauryan dynasty understood that life inside the palace was very different from the peaceful image most people imagined. Behind the magnificent halls, elaborate ceremonies, and royal celebrations existed a world of political alliances, rivalries, and constant uncertainty. Every conversation carried hidden meaning, every friendship could become a political advantage, and every decision had the potential to shape the future of the empire. From an early age, Ashoka learned that being born into royalty was not simply a privilege. It was a responsibility that demanded discipline, intelligence, and resilience. Much about Ashoka's childhood remains uncertain because reliable historical records from this period are limited. Many stories describing his youth were written centuries later by Buddhist scholars who wished to highlight the remarkable transformation that would eventually define his life. As a result, historians cannot always separate historical fact from legend. Some accounts portray him as an overlooked prince who lacked the charm of his brothers, while others describe him as exceptionally intelligent, fearless, and naturally gifted in leadership. Although the details vary, most historians agree that Ashoka received the education expected of a future ruler. He studied military strategy, statecraft, diplomacy, administration, philosophy, and the principles of governing a vast empire. He also trained tirelessly in horseback riding, archery, swordsmanship, and the physical disciplines required of a prince who might one day lead armies into battle. Unlike many royal children who spent most of their lives inside palace walls, Ashoka was given practical responsibilities at a relatively young age. Rather than learning about government only through books and advisors, he was sent to govern provinces far from the imperial capital of Pataliputra. These assignments were more than symbolic gestures. Provincial governors were responsible for maintaining law and order, collecting taxes, supervising trade, resolving disputes, and protecting the empire's borders. Success required patience, sound judgment, and the ability to make difficult decisions under pressure. Historical traditions suggest that Ashoka served as governor of Ujjain, one of the empire's most important commercial centers, where merchants from distant lands exchanged goods, cultures, and ideas. If these accounts are accurate, the experience would have exposed the young prince to the complexity of ruling a diverse population and strengthened the leadership skills that would later define his reign. As Ashoka gained experience, his reputation began to grow. Military commanders respected his courage, administrators recognized his efficiency, and many within the empire viewed him as a capable leader who could solve difficult problems. Yet admiration alone did not guarantee a peaceful future. Within the royal family, the question of succession continued to cast a long shadow over every prince. Emperor Bindusara had several sons, and although tradition often favored the eldest heir, the reality of royal succession was rarely straightforward. Influence, military support, political alliances, and personal ability all played important roles in determining who would eventually inherit the throne. Every ambitious prince understood that the competition extended far beyond family relationships. As Emperor Bindusara's health gradually declined, uncertainty spread throughout the empire. Noble families, ministers, military leaders, and provincial governors quietly considered where their loyalties should lie. The stability of one of the world's greatest empires depended upon a successful transfer of power, yet history shows that transitions between rulers often became moments of great danger. Ashoka found himself at the center of this uncertainty. Whether through his leadership, military ability, or political support, he steadily emerged as one of the strongest contenders for the throne. The young prince who had once lived in the shadow of his brothers was becoming impossible to ignore. No one could yet foresee the extraordinary transformation that awaited him, but the experiences of his youth had already forged a leader of remarkable determination. The prince who had spent years preparing to rule was now approaching the greatest challenge of his life. The struggle for the Mauryan throne, a conflict that would shape not only his own destiny, but the future of one of history's greatest empires. Chapter 3. The Rise of the Ruthless Conqueror. When Emperor Bindusara died around 273 BCE, the Mauryan Empire entered one of the most uncertain periods in its history. Stretching across much of the Indian subcontinent, the empire had grown into one of the largest political powers of the ancient world. But like many great empires, its greatest vulnerability came not from enemies beyond its borders, but from the question of who would rule next. Several princes had legitimate claims to the throne, each supported by different nobles, military commanders, and influential members of the royal court. Although the exact details of the succession remain uncertain, historians generally agree that Ashoka's rise to power was marked by intense political rivalry. It was a struggle that demanded intelligence, determination, and the ability to make difficult decisions in a world where weakness often meant defeat. After several years of uncertainty, Ashoka was finally crowned emperor around 268 BCE. The prince who had once been underestimated now ruled an empire unlike any India had seen before. Yet wearing the imperial crown brought challenges far greater than winning it. Ashoka inherited a vast realm of different languages, cultures, religions, and traditions. Keeping such an enormous empire united required constant vigilance, efficient administration, and above all, unquestioned authority. Every distant province had to remain loyal. Every trade route had to stay secure. Every neighboring kingdom watched closely for signs of weakness. During the early years of his reign, Ashoka ruled much like the powerful kings who came before him. He believed that a stable empire depended on strength, discipline, and the willingness to use military force whenever necessary. The Mauryan army was one of the most formidable military forces of the ancient world, with thousands of infantry, skilled cavalry, war chariots, and heavily trained elephants capable of overwhelming nearly any opponent. Maintaining such an army required remarkable organization, and Ashoka continued strengthening the administrative systems that supported it. Roads connected distant provinces, taxes financed public works and military campaigns, and governors ensured that imperial law was enforced throughout the empire. Although later Buddhist writings would describe this period by calling him Ashoka the Fierce, modern historians caution that these accounts were written centuries after his reign to emphasize the dramatic contrast between his early life and his later transformation. Even so, there is little doubt that Ashoka was an ambitious ruler determined to preserve and expand the empire he had inherited. Like many kings of the ancient world, he believed that peace was achieved not by avoiding conflict, but by demonstrating overwhelming power. Only one major kingdom remained outside Mauryan control. That kingdom was Kalinga. Located along the eastern coast of India, Kalinga occupied a strategically important position between the Mauryan heartland and the Bay of Bengal. Its prosperous ports connected merchants with distant lands, making it one of the wealthiest trading centers in the region. More importantly, Kalinga had successfully maintained its independence despite the growing power of the Mauryan Empire. To Ashoka, this independent kingdom represented more than a missing territory on the map. It was a challenge to imperial unity and a reminder that his empire was still incomplete. Convinced that Kalinga must be brought under Mauryan rule, Ashoka began preparing for what he believed would be the final campaign needed to secure his empire. Across the kingdom, blacksmiths forged weapons, engineers prepared supply routes, soldiers assembled in vast formations, and war elephants were equipped for battle. Thousands of men answered the emperor's call, confident that another victory awaited them. At the same time, the people of Kalinga gathered their own forces, fully aware of the enormous army advancing toward their borders. They understood they were greatly outnumbered, yet they refused to surrender the freedom their ancestors had defended for generations. As the Mauryan army marched east, banners fluttered above endless columns of soldiers, while the ground trembled beneath the footsteps of armored elephants. Ashoka rode at the center of his army with the confidence of a ruler who had never experienced true defeat. He believed he was marching toward the greatest victory of his reign. He could not have known that beyond the horizon waited a battle that would forever change not only his own life, but the course of history itself. Chapter 4. The Battle That Changed Everything. The march toward Kalinga marked the beginning of the most important campaign of Ashoka's reign. For months, the Mauryan Empire had prepared for war. Thousands of soldiers gathered from every corner of the empire, while blacksmiths forged weapons, engineers repaired roads, and supply wagons carried food and equipment across vast distances. At the front of the advancing army marched the empire's most feared weapon, massive war elephants clad in armor, accompanied by disciplined infantry, skilled archers, and experienced cavalry. Ashoka had already proven himself a capable military leader, and like the great rulers before him, he believed that expanding the empire was both his duty and his destiny. To him, Kalinga represented the final obstacle to a unified empire. Unlike many neighboring kingdoms, Kalinga had remained proudly independent. Located along India's eastern coast, it controlled valuable trade routes and enjoyed both wealth and strategic importance. More importantly, its people refused to surrender their freedom. They understood the strength of the Mauryan army, yet they chose to defend their homeland rather than submit without a fight. As news of Ashoka's advancing forces spread across the kingdom, villages strengthened their defenses, soldiers prepared for battle, and ordinary families faced the frightening reality that war was approaching their homes. When the two armies finally met, the plains of Kalinga became one of the largest battlefields the ancient Indian world had ever witnessed. The silence of dawn lasted only a few moments before thousands of arrows filled the sky, signaling the beginning of the conflict. War drums thundered across the valley as disciplined lines of Mauryan infantry advanced behind towering elephants, while the defenders of Kalinga stood their ground with remarkable courage. What followed was a battle of overwhelming violence. Spears shattered against shields, swords clashed relentlessly, and the ground trembled beneath charging elephants. Dust and smoke quickly swallowed the battlefield, making it nearly impossible for soldiers to distinguish friend from enemy. For hours, the fighting continued without pause. Kalinga's warriors resisted with extraordinary determination, knowing they were defending not only their kingdom but also their families, their homes, and their way of life. Yet despite their courage, they faced an army larger, better equipped, and supported by the immense resources of the Mauryan Empire. Gradually, the defenders began to lose ground. One defensive line after another collapsed as Ashoka's forces pushed deeper into the kingdom. By late afternoon, organized resistance had begun to crumble, and the battle spread into nearby villages, where civilians found themselves caught in the devastation. As the sun slowly descended, the sounds of victory were drowned out by something far more powerful. The cries of the wounded, the grief of families searching for loved ones, and the silence left behind by thousands of lives cut short. The battlefield was littered with broken weapons, shattered chariots, and fallen soldiers from both sides. Victory had come, but it had demanded an unimaginable price. History remembers the Battle of Kalinga not because it expanded the Mauryan Empire, but because it transformed the man who won it. In the days that followed, Ashoka would walk across these devastated fields and witness the true consequences of war. The images of suffering, loss, and destruction would remain with him for the rest of his life. What he saw after the battle would challenge everything he had once believed about power, conquest, and greatness. The emperor, who had marched into Kalinga seeking glory, would soon begin questioning whether any victory built upon so much suffering could truly be called a victory at all. That question would become the turning point not only of Ashoka's life, but of history itself. Chapter 5. A different kind of victory. The morning after the Battle of Kalinga arrived in complete silence. The thunder of war drums had faded, the clash of steel was over, and the battlefield that had echoed with violence only hours before was now filled with the cries of the wounded and the grief of those searching for loved ones. Ashoka had dreamed of this moment for years. The conquest of Kalinga was supposed to complete the Mauryan Empire and secure his place among the greatest rulers in history. By every military measure, he had succeeded. Yet, as the sun rose over the devastated landscape, victory felt strangely empty. Leaving behind the celebrations his generals expected, Ashoka rode toward the battlefield. As he walked among the ruins, he saw broken chariots, shattered weapons, and countless soldiers from both armies lying side by side. Death had erased every difference between victor and defeated. Nearby, families searched desperately for husbands, fathers, and sons. Children wandered through the smoke in silence, too young to understand why the people they loved would never return. The battlefield was no longer a symbol of glory. It had become a reminder of the terrible cost of ambition. Although history does not record every scene Ashoka witnessed that day, his own inscriptions reveal how deeply the experience affected him. Years later, in what historians call Major Rock Edict 13, Ashoka wrote that more than 100,000 people were killed, 150,000 were deported, and many more died from the suffering caused by the war. While historians debate whether these numbers are exact or symbolic, the message is unmistakable. The destruction of Kalinga haunted the emperor for the rest of his life. Unlike most rulers of the ancient world, Ashoka did not celebrate this victory. Kings usually built monuments to glorify their military triumphs and portray themselves as fearless conquerors. Ashoka chose something extraordinary instead. He publicly expressed regret. He wanted future generations to remember not only that Kalinga had been conquered, but also the immense human suffering that conquest had created. As weeks passed, reports continued arriving from the newly conquered province. Villages had been destroyed, families separated, and countless survivors struggled to rebuild their lives. Each report reminded Ashoka that the consequences of war did not end when the fighting stopped. The battlefield disappeared, but the suffering remained. Gradually, he began questioning everything he had once believed about power. Could true greatness really be measured by the amount of land an emperor conquered? Could fear ever create lasting peace? Was there another way to lead an empire? These questions marked the beginning of a remarkable transformation. Ashoka realized that while armies could conquer kingdoms, they could never win the hearts of people. Lasting peace required something stronger than fear. It required justice, compassion, and respect for human life. For perhaps the first time, the emperor understood that the greatest victories were not won through violence, but through wisdom and moral leadership. The memories of Kalinga never left him. Every royal ceremony and every reminder of his empire's power brought back images of the battlefield and the innocent lives forever changed by his decisions. Rather than allowing those memories to fade, Ashoka let them reshape his life. The conqueror who had once sought glory through expansion now began searching for a higher purpose. The Battle of Kalinga gave Ashoka everything he thought he wanted: greater territory, unmatched power, and a place among history's great emperors. Yet, standing among the ruins, he discovered a profound truth. The greatest ruler is not the one who conquers the most land, but the one who prevents the most suffering. That realization would soon inspire one of the most extraordinary transformations in history, as Ashoka prepared to exchange the path of conquest for the path of Dharma, a philosophy of compassion, justice, and peace that would influence millions of people for centuries to come. Chapter 6. The Emperor History Would Never Forget. The transformation of Ashoka did not happen overnight. He did not return from Kalinga as a completely different man, nor did he abandon the responsibilities of ruling one of the world's largest empires in a single moment. Real change rarely happens that way. Instead, the memories of the battlefield remained with him, quietly reshaping the way he viewed power, leadership, and the purpose of an emperor. Rather than seeking another military campaign, Ashoka began searching for a different kind of victory, one that could not be won with swords, elephants, or armies. It was during this period of reflection that he embraced the teachings of Buddhism, not simply as a personal belief, but as a guide for governing an empire. Inspired by the principles of compassion, non-violence, self-discipline, and respect for all living beings, Ashoka gradually redirected the immense resources of the Mauryan Empire away from conquest and toward the well-being of its people. His vision of leadership became unlike anything the ancient world had seen. Instead of measuring success by the number of kingdoms he controlled, Ashoka began measuring it by the welfare of those who lived under his rule. He ordered the construction of roads that connected distant parts of the empire, making travel safer for merchants, pilgrims, and ordinary families. Shade trees were planted along major routes to protect travelers from the harsh sun, and wells were dug at regular intervals so that clean water would always be available. Rest houses were established where weary travelers could find shelter during long journeys, demonstrating that even the smallest acts of kindness could strengthen an empire more effectively than fear. Ashoka also expanded public welfare in ways that were extraordinary for his time. Historical inscriptions describe the establishment of medical facilities for both people and animals, reflecting his belief that compassion should extend beyond humanity itself. He encouraged the planting of medicinal herbs throughout the empire and promoted policies designed to reduce unnecessary suffering. Certain forms of animal sacrifice and hunting were restricted, and officials were instructed to govern with fairness rather than cruelty. While the Mauryan Empire still required laws and order, Ashoka increasingly believed that justice should be guided by mercy whenever possible. He understood that a ruler's greatest responsibility was not simply to command obedience, but to earn the trust of those he governed. Perhaps the most remarkable legacy of Ashoka's reign was his decision to communicate directly with his people. Across the empire, he ordered messages to be carved into massive rocks and polished stone pillars placed along roads, near cities, and at important gathering places. These inscriptions, known today as the Edicts of Ashoka, did not boast about military victories or celebrate royal achievements. Instead, they encouraged honesty, compassion, religious tolerance, respect for parents and teachers, kindness toward neighbors, and care for all living creatures. They revealed an emperor who believed that moral character was the true foundation of a strong society. More than 2,000 years later, many of these inscriptions still survive, allowing modern historians to hear Ashoka's own words across the centuries. His influence reached far beyond the borders of India. Ashoka supported the spread of Buddhist teachings by sending missionaries to regions across Asia, including present-day Sri Lanka, Central Asia, and parts of Southeast Asia. According to historical tradition, his own son Mahinda and daughter Sanghamita traveled to Sri Lanka, where they played a significant role in establishing Buddhism on the island. From these early efforts, Buddhist philosophy gradually spread across much of Asia, influencing cultures, governments, art, and spiritual traditions for generations. While Ashoka could never have imagined the full impact of his decisions, the values he embraced after Kalinga would eventually reach millions of people across the world. Today, Ashoka is remembered not because he conquered Kalinga, but because he allowed that victory to change him. Many rulers have built vast empires through force, yet few are remembered with admiration centuries after their kingdoms disappeared. Ashoka's greatest achievement was not expanding the Mauryan Empire to its greatest size, but recognizing that true greatness lies in the courage to learn from one's mistakes. His journey reminds us that the most powerful transformation is not the conquest of others, but the conquest of our own pride, anger, and ambition. Long after the Mauryan Empire faded into history, the lessons Ashoka discovered continued to inspire generations, proving that compassion can leave a legacy far stronger than any army ever could. More than 2,000 years have passed since Ashoka stood on the blood-soaked fields of Kalinga. The empire he ruled eventually faded. Its cities changed. Its armies disappeared. Time erased its borders and scattered its monuments across the landscape. Yet one decision made by a single man continues to echo through history. Ashoka proved that the greatest victories are not always won on the battlefield. Sometimes they are won within the human heart. He conquered kingdoms through force, but he conquered himself through wisdom. He discovered that fear can build an empire, but only compassion can build a legacy. While countless rulers are remembered for the wars they started, Ashoka is remembered for the violence he chose to end. His transformation reminds us that true strength is not measured by how much power we can gain over others, but by how much control we can gain over ourselves. His story also challenges each of us with an uncomfortable question. If a man who commanded one of the largest armies in the ancient world could admit that conquest alone brings no lasting peace, what battles are we still fighting in our own lives? How often do we pursue success, status, revenge, or recognition, believing they will finally make us whole, only to discover that the peace we seek has always depended on the choices we make within ourselves? History is often taught as a collection of dates, names, and battles, but its greatest purpose is something far more meaningful. History is a mirror. It allows us to see our own ambitions, fears, mistakes, and possibilities reflected in the lives of those who came before us. The rise and fall of every civilization carries lessons that remain as relevant today as they were centuries ago. Empires may disappear, but human nature changes very little. Ashoka's greatest monument was never carved from stone. It was the example he left behind, an emperor who learned that mercy could be stronger than violence. A conqueror who discovered that wisdom outlives victory. A ruler who proved that the most powerful revolution begins when a single person chooses a different path. If this story changed the way you see history, let us know in the comments below. We'd love to hear which part of Ashoka's incredible journey surprised you the most, and what other civilizations, empires, or legendary figures you'd like us to explore next. If you enjoyed this video, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Every week we uncover the untold stories of the world's greatest civilizations, legendary leaders, forgotten kingdoms, and extraordinary moments that shaped the course of human history. Thank you for watching and for joining us on this journey through the past. Until next time, remember this: every empire rises, every empire falls, but the stories they leave behind continue to shape the world we live in today. Thank you for being a part of Historixa. Your curiosity keeps these stories alive. Until our next journey into history, take care, and we'll see you in the next documentary.